Near the Cimmerian land, deep caverned, lies a hollow mount, the home of sluggish sleep, where never ray from morn or evening skies can enter, but where blackening vapors creep, and doubtful gloom unbroken sway doth keep. There never crested bird evokes the dawn, nor watchful dogs disturb the silence deep, nor wandering beast, nor forest tempest torn, nor harsher sound of human passions born. Mute quiet reigns, but from the lowest cave a spring, Lethean rising evermore, pours through the murmuring rocks a slumberous wave. The plenteous poppy blossoms at the door, and countless herbs of night the drowsy store. This poem by Digby Mackworth Dolben is addressed to the Roman god of sleep Somnus, the Latin name for the god whom the Greeks called Hypnos. The poet invites the reader into the land of the Cimmerians, a mythical race of people who were believed to have lived near the land of the dead, endlessly enshrouded by mists and darkness due to their proximity to the abode of those forever departed, who slumber eternally. But beyond their land, we are invited into a deep cavern, and thereafter to a hollow mount, which is home of, quote, sluggish sleep. This is a place where no living being stirs, and no light shines, not even dawn herself is allowed to bring the coming of day. The silence is, quote, deep, and, quote, no harsher sound of human passions born. We are in a place where no human activity belongs, with its signs of life and vitality, action, noise, and purposefulness. As we descend into the cave, the poet shows us a spring in the lowest portion, showing us the Lethean waters rising from it, and in combination with reference to the poppy, with its somnolent and dream-inducing lethargy caused by opium, we are brought closer and closer, not only to sleep, but to sleep's twin, death. It should not be surprising, therefore, to hear that the dead referred to as Camontes, the tired ones. Hypnos is indeed a strange god, and one would imagine that a cult dedicated to him would have been more pronounced and ubiquitous in the ancient world, given that each living being must succumb to his powers every night, or eventually die of exhaustion. It is true that his epithet is pandamator, all subjugating. This law applies not only to mortals, but to the immortals as well. In a famous scene in Book 14 of the Iliad, we are witness to Hera's plan of seducing Zeus and ensuring he succumbed to a post-coital slumber in order to bind him while she carries on her influence of the Trojan War. She rushes to Lemnos, quote, the city of godlike Thoas. There she met Sleep, the brother of Death, and she clasped him by the hand and spake and addressed him, Sleep, Lord of all gods and of all men, if ever thou didst hearken to word of mine, so do thou even now obey. I will owe thee thanks all my days. Lull me to sleep the bright eyes of Zeus beneath his brows, so soon as I shall have lain me by his side in love. Hypnos is terrified of putting Zeus to sleep. He has a past experience of Zeus's wrath when Hypnos was engaged in some other mischief in an earlier incident that he recalls to Hera. And Hypnos asks her to swear by an incredibly forceful oath that would have severe repercussions if a god reneged upon it. For she swears over the waters of the Styx that she will in fact uphold her end of the bargain. Because Zeus is the ever-vigilant and all-seeing king of the gods, there is nothing that evades his attention. As a brief aside, this godlike attention and awareness and sleeplessness of Zeus is translated into the mortal sphere when it comes to human kings and semi-divine heroes. For it is expected that a true leader will remain awake, planning and ensuring the safety and success of his men at the cost of a night's rest. The difference, however, between Zeus's all-seeing and all-knowing state of sleeplessness and King Agamemnon's is that when Zeus is awake and deliberates, it is, quote, bodiless and wordless, as Montiglio states, and almost immediately and effectively converted into action, unlike Agamemnon's, Achilles's, or Odysseus's, who express physical, mental, and emotional agitation, and only with the expenditure of incredible exertion and inner turmoil do they arrive at a plan of action. To return to our scenario of Zeus, Hera, and Hypnos, we see the significance of this putting to sleep of Zeus. To reiterate, the reason why Hera needs to employ the aid of Hypnos is because Hypnos alone can, quote, charm even the eyes of Zeus, as said by the poet Meleager. When Zeus is asleep, his eyes and mind remain open and vigilant. Therefore, when a god needs to rest from prolonged exertion or overexertion, their sleep never really deactivates their power. Many people who collect little figurines of the cherubic-like Eros are enamored of his seeming innocence and sleepful repose, seeing him in a state of childlike vulnerability. But it is important to remember this fact, that this image is a full-blown deception. Like Zeus, the cosmogonic Eros is forever wakeful and ready to exert his powers whenever the god deems it fit. In a sense, there is a paradox here. By following the sleeping rhythms of human beings, the gods are brought in sympathy and closer association of mortals. But it would be a grave error to assume that the gods' resting is like mortal resting. For as a Homeric hymn to Apollo demonstrates, Apollo the far shooter only takes rest on his travels in order to promote and spread his cult. Human notions of fatigue and tiredness do not apply to the gods. Sleep is often associated with the epithets of soft or sweet, and therefore the gods indulge in this state, not from any lack in their being, like energy for instance, but simply through the pleasures of experiencing it. Similarly, the gods are never hungry when they dine on ambrosia or nectar, but do so through sheer pleasure and the joys of feasting. Silvia Montiglio highlights an important and tragic outcome that is often unacknowledged amidst plenty of laughter and mirth in this so-called comical scene of Zeus when he is being duped by his wife and being placed in a coma. The result of Zeus becoming temporarily incapacitated in this state means that his vigilance is placed on hold, while thousands of soldiers are simultaneously perishing in the armed conflict without any of Zeus's oversight and steering of his master plan. In this sense, Silvia Montiglio observes, quote, Zeus is overcome, demeus, by sleep, as the warriors are by death. In fact, there are many instances of Homer using the verb damnemi, meaning to sleep, in the past tense, to suggest either cowardice or death. This coma is something that we should touch upon. Earlier, we described how Hera promises to give the agreed-upon gifts to Hypnos should he aid her in her plan. She swears by the Styx, and it is precisely this oath which, when broken, plummets a god to the closest experience they have of death, and this is coma. Etymologically, it is related to the word kophos, which signifies deafness and dumbness, or as Hippocrates suggests, a state of unconsciousness, which he differentiates from hypnos, as sleep more generally. After all, when people are in a state of a coma in a hospital, it is obvious that they are in a deeper layer of unconscious activity than mere sleep. Furthermore, many other natural philosophers and ancient physiologists associated sleep, hypnos, with a state of activity. In Hesiod's Theogony, we read, quote, For whoever the Immortals, who possess the peak of snowy Olympus, swears a false oath after having poured a libation from her, he lies breathless for 1 full year. And he does not go near to ambrosia and nectar for nourishment, but lies there without breath and without voice on a covered bed. And an evil stupor shrouds him. Kakonde epi koma kalupte. This coma is a deathlike state, albeit never permanent. And so, in a sense, the relation between death and sleep is such that death can only exert its absolute dominion over the mortal realm, effectively bookmarking a life's beginning and its end. But sleep is much more extensive in its domain, for it can also affect the gods and compel them to endure a state of unconsciousness like death, but unlike death itself, eventually releases them from its bonds. It is also important to observe the verb kalupte, this idea of a shroud or a covering. This is the same verb derivation for the dame Calypso, literally the coverer, who was the nymph who had enchanted Odysseus on his travels and had attempted to detain him forever. The idea of covering could be a topic for another time, but it is important to note that not only the gods and titans like Kronos are covered in these depths, but also human beings upon burial and at nighttime before bed. This covering is a mode by which things are made invisible, and so the dead are also brought into a realm ruled by Hades, whose name means the unseen one of his accoutrements being his helmet of invisibility. Death is similarly a covering. It is not necessarily a personified agent, but is often the covering itself. In Homer, it is often depicted as something the dead had to willingly put on, amphibalonto. And in this sense, like sleep, it is something that impairs one's experience of the world around them and prevents them from perceiving with their senses. Similar to this is the imagery of sleep as being poured over the sleeper, which also manages to cover them. Alcmaeon of Croton refers to dreams that sleep evokes. These he calls, quote, the dreams that dwell beneath the rock, in reference to Odyssey Book 19, and especially Book 24, where Penelope describes the chthonic dwelling place of dreams. Quote, past the streams of ocean and the white rock they went, past the gates of Helios in the land of dreams. Suddenly they came to the asphodel meadow. With Hesiod's Theogony, we see the birth of dream and sleep from night. Quote, and night bore hateful doom and black fate and death, and she bore sleep and the tribe of dreams. The Theogony must be read as acts that occurred in a simultaneous present, because the workings of the gods are not encumbered by time as we experience it. But on the other hand, the ordering of lists of names of divinities is incredibly important in order to elucidate the relations among the gods themselves. Therefore, let us momentarily observe that for the purposes of our discussion, night, or nux, first bears death, then bears sleep, and then bears dreams. For the majority of beings, the state of sleep prepares the ground necessary to experience dreams. And in the Greek of the Theogony, we encounter a word phulon, which means tribes, which are associated with Oneiros, or dreams. This notion of tribes suggests a multiplicity and differentiates among dream images, but also highlights their unity as a collective. In this sense, the multiform and dispersive nature of Oneiros makes it rather difficult to personify as a distinct individuated god. This, of course, had not prevented worshippers in antiquity from offering up statues as thanks to Oneiros in incubation shrines for healing dreams. But interestingly enough, Homer does manage to demonstrate some sort of personification and stability of composition to Oneiros, when the dream sent by a god is depicted hovering over the head of the dreamer in order to relay a message. Alcmaeon of Croton was the first pre-Socratic philosopher to view sleep from a distinctly physiological perspective, and one of the things he believed was that the process of falling asleep was gradual. Sleep comes upon the person when their blood retreats to their veins, and as the movement of blood retreats, the external body temperature drops. If the blood and the heat associated with it continues to retreat, the ultimate outcome is death and the frigid cold of the corpse. Ultimately, what we are seeing here in physiological and scientific terms is the continuum between the mythological pair of Hypnos on the one hand and Thanatos, or death, at the other extreme. As the twin brother of Hypnos, famously depicted in images of Hypnos and Thanatos carrying the corpse of Sarpedon away from the battlefield at Troy, we are left with a strange ambivalence. On the one hand, Hypnos is described as, quote, sweet or soft and blissful, and according to incubation shrines, can bring health and healing. But on the other hand, it is described as sketlios, or cruel, or deenon, terrible. No doubt one of the reasons why this ambiguity exists is because sleep so closely resembles death and verges on the threshold of death's door, that there is always a remote fear of never reawakening. A rather brutal example is illustrated in the Iliad in Book 10, where King Rhesus of Thrace, who fought against the Trojans, is murdered in his sleep that was sent to him by Athena. Quote, "But when the son of Tydeus came to the king, him the 13th he robbed of honey-sweet life, as he breathed hard. For like to an evil dream there stood above his head that night the son of Oneiros' son, by the devise of Athene." Besides the observation that Athena is also able to commit a mortal to the state of sleep or even coma, as can also be seen in Euripides' play Heracles, where the hero is effectively knocked out by her, it is apparent from this Iliadic scene that King Rhesus is having a sort of a nightmare, from which he never emerges. This in itself is rather nightmarish, to have fallen asleep, never to wake again. In a sense, we can surmise that his violent dream anticipated his violent end, without the reprieve of waking from his deathlike slumber and emerging to the waking world. What this fundamentally highlights, with many instances explored in the Iliad, is that wartime is not the time for restful sleep. Sleep itself is a great danger, and can not only inhibit life-preserving action for self-defense, but also propel the warrior into a state of sleeplessness and insomnia. There is a further association between Eros and Thanatos, and sleeplessness can result not simply from the presence of dangers and the need for vigilance, but also out of love and desire. It is often the case that the lover remains in a pained state of desirousness, staying up all night, while the beloved remains blissfully unaware and undisturbed, enfolded in sleep. I don't want to spend too much time on this dynamic of Eros and Thanatos, but I would like to end this video with a poem that combines elements of erotic desire and longing and Hypnos. The poem Ode to Sleep, or Somnus, was composed by the 1st century AD Roman poet Statius. And in this poem, the poet is describing himself in a state of insomnia. At line 14, he says, "But now, alas, if any lover, during the long nighttime hours, holding his arms entwined around a girl, drives you away from him on purpose, then please come to me instead." This is translated by Melissa Beck. This is suggestive of Greek and Roman erotic and amatory poetry, where sleep is dismissed because of lovers who delight in staying awake throughout the night. The suggestion is that the poet is enticing Somnus himself to visit his bed, if Somnus feels rejected by the cavorting of others. Later on, in lines 18 to 19, Statius says, quote, "But touch me with the very tip of your wand, for that is enough, or tread over me lightly with your raised foot." Gibson remarks in the essay Statius and Insomnia that this image of the wand has erotic overtones, and there is a distinctly phallic association embedded within this poem. The poem is effectively embodying the desirous and the forlorn lover, and the close reading of the poem suggests that the poet is not simply laying awake in bed, but is actually observing the starry sky while positioned near a window, in a classic pose of romantic longing, waiting for his departed lover. In essence, Gibson observes, this poem is not a prayer to Somnus, but is a plea to the god for pity, so that the seduction can bring with it blissful sleep and a balm for the suffering, tired, and sleepless poet. Now that we have discussed sleep, let us let the dreams descend upon us. Take care for now.